Hi everyone. First, I'd like to thank Instructor Dazzle again for this amazing opportunity to speak with you all. And today, my guest lecture will be on the topic of representation. I'm extremely excited to be talking about this. As I mentioned in our last talk, my research is about representation essentially. So my work again looks at queer and trans fat people of color and how they represent themselves in the media. And so as we think about representation, this conversation has been incredibly stimulating and incredibly developing in my own thoughts about this topic. And so the biggest question that I think is dominating popular culture right now is the question of, does representation matter? And I think that, as we'll get into shortly, there's no perfect way to answer this question. But I think that this question, we've been seeing it a lot, especially in the wake of continuous anti black police brutality, continuous racism, sexism, and transphobia in media. And we will continue to see it unravel as we continue on. But I think we all have some familiarity with this question as we've seen it play out on the day to day basis, and especially on social media. So, whether you get to this now or later, I'd like for you to reflect on your own experiences with representation. So, with my own students, I love to do free writes with them at the start of our lessons and lectures and conversations in order for them to first just work on writing freely and reflecting freely, and then coming with those experiences into the talk. So on Blackboard, Instructor Dazzle will have a discussion board for you to answer these questions. First, what artists, creatives, performers, or characters do you relate to in media? And then, inversely, what kinds of artists and characters have you taken issue with in media? So, by posing these two questions, I want us to think about, what is our relationship to media. I think that we all have seen people who we might really resonate with, who we identify with, who empower us, and we've also seen people who we just do not identify with, who take issue with, or who we just look at and do not see ourselves in. And so I want you all to just take some time, whether it's now or after this lecture, to start reflecting on your experiences with people you see on media platforms. And so, if the question today is, does representation matter? I want us to historicize and contextualize this conversation, because representation and the question of, does representation matter, has been a historical debate for decades now. One could argue for at least a century. And so, to contextualize this, I want to share a few quotes by people doing work on representation on race and gender in recent academic scholarship. So first, I want us to consider the notion of the trap of the visible, of the visual, meaning being represented visually could be a gift and a curse. So this excerpt is from a book titled Trapdoor: Trans Cultural Production and the Politics of Visibility, and it reads as follows. This is the trap of the visual. It offers, or more accurately, it is frequently offered to us as the primary path through which trans people might have access to livable lives. Representation is said to remedy broader acute social crises, ranging from poverty to murder to police violence, particularly when representation is taken up as a teaching tool that allows those outside our immediate worlds and identities to glimpse some notion of a shared humanity. They continue to say, To the degree that anyone might consider such potential to exist within representation, one must also grapple and reckon with the radical incongruities, as when, for example, our transgender tipping point comes to pass at precisely the same political moment when women of color, and trans women of color in particular, are experiencing markedly increasing instances of political violence. And so I begin with this quote because I think it shows us how representation is typically thought of. So when we think about representation, representation is thought of as monumentous, groundbreaking, and the way of achieving liberation. By presenting people in media who have never been represented before or represented on their own terms, we are achieving progress not only as members of marginalized communities, but also for them themselves. Being visible, getting paid to be in media can change someone's life tremendously and give them access to popularity and money that they might not have access to before. However, as we see with the second half of the quote, representation might not be everything it's sought out to be because as we're seeing more and more trans women, trans people, and trans women of color and trans people of color in media, we're also getting to a point where the rates of transphobia and the rates of violence against trans people is increasingly growing by the year. Studies are showing that even 2021 is deemed the most violent year for trans people yet. But simultaneously, representation of trans people in the media is also increasing. So again, this question of does representation matter is tricky because in some ways it does, and at the same time it doesn't, or it might be counterproductive. There are some people who argue that the more trans people are represented in media, the more targeted trans people will be for violence. And so this is what we might consider the trap of the visual. Similarly, 12 years prior to Trapdoor, Celine Pareñas Shimizu wrote an article called The Bind of Representation, Performing and Consuming Hypersexuality in Miss Saigon. Shimizu is looking at Asian American women and the tropes of eroticism, fetishization, and hypersexuality placed upon Asian American women. So, the bind of representation is a theory as follows. Within the bind of representation, representation is understood as misrecognition, especially for marginal subjects. The conceptualization of the bind of representation thus highlights the limitations of demands for positive images in identification and redress and protest. The looking for myself approach to popular images is a kind of doomed narcissism, for one cannot find oneself wholly and directly in representation. I refuse the ideology of I want to become that, or I refuse to become that unless it looks like me. Shimizu continues, popular representation is a site for the powerful to speak through the industries of popular culture, and for actors and audiences to insert critical revisions. As such, representation is a conversation from which lessons about power can be extracted and where freedom of the spectator individual can be exercised even within constraints. So the bind of representation is a tricky concept, but I think what I want us to focus on is this notion on the previous slide of I want to become that or I refuse to become that unless that looks like me. Representation does a lot of important work because many people, including myself, have seen people on social media, TV shows, and music, and have thought to myself, wow, I want to be like that person. That person empowers me to live my truest life. But at the same time, scholars sometimes are critical of representation being perfect. Shimizu writes that the looking for myself approach to popular images is a kind of doomed narcissism, for one cannot find oneself wholly and directly in representation. So Shimizu is critical of people who think that representation is perfect. However, Shimizu also notes that while representation is not perfect, representation teaches us about power. And I think that is where I want us to land. It might not be as constructive to say does representation matter, but nonetheless, wherever you slide in this argument, representation may or may not matter, but representation teaches us about power in really important ways. And so before I move on, I wanted to take a pause really quickly to talk about the notion of a cultural institution. So again, my PhD that I'm almost completing is in American Studies, which is the study of American culture. And American culture is really concerned about thinking about cultural institutions and the places in which culture is produced. So for us, I want us to define a cultural institution as organizations that are responsible for creating, promoting, and spreading culture. Examples of cultural institutions include churches, the media, the movie industry, the music industry, museums, and libraries. And the reason that I'm bringing up cultural institutions is because these are the structures and organizations that are responsible for educating the masses on what is normal and what is okay and acceptable in society. And again, the notion of a cultural institution is useful because when we think about an institution, whether it's like the university or I'm trying to think like a corporation, for example, structures and institutions let us help us see who is allowed into those institutions, who is not allowed in those institutions, and what are the norms of an institution and what are the exceptions to an institution. So, like any sort of physical space, people are allowed in, people are allowed out, and there's certain norms and behaviors that are considered acceptable and ones that are not. So, if we think about cultural institutions like other physical spaces that can be gatekeeping and exclusionary, then I think that will help us think about how the structure of the media and industries that produce media are also doing this work of keeping people out and letting people in. And I also want to bring up this phenomenal theory of desirability politics. So this is Caleb Luna. They are a fifth year PhD in performance studies at UC Berkeley, and their dissertation is on performances of eating in the media. And so Caleb Luna is responsible for theorizing a theory called desirability politics, or in other words, the politics of desirability. And desirability politics is a theory that states that who we find desirable sexually, romantically, and platonically is informed by systems of oppression. And basically, when we think of someone as desirable, we are applying Eurocentric notions of beauty upon them. And Eurocentric notions of beauty include whiteness, thinness, straight sizedness, able bodiedness, upper class status, etc. And so, again, to clarify, it states that anybody who has desire is having that desire and has learned that desire from systems of oppression and usually through the media. And so I bring this up here because while this theory is really helpful for thinking about how we interact on the day to day, I want to bring it up here because this desirability politics extends to the media. Usually when people get cast for shows, movies, or who gets successful in the music industry, it's always based on who is considered desirable and who is considered attractive enough to invest in, and who's beautiful enough to be consumed. And so when you engage with media, whether it's music, art, dance, TV shows, and film, also look at the kinds of bodies that are being represented. Are they considered beautiful? Are they straight? Are they skinny? Are they cisgender? Are they light skin? Are they dark skin? Are they able bodied? Because those things definitely matter here. And yeah, so this theory is super important. So now I want to pivot to how do we evaluate representation in media? So there's no perfect way to engage and evaluate media, but here I just want to propose some kinds of things to consider as you're going about looking at media. So to start us off, I think one of the most important things to consider is a trope. And so the Oxford English Dictionary defines a trope as a verb, not as a noun. It is a noun and it's a verb, but a trope as a verb means to represent or interpret something in a figurative or metaphorical way. But I think the second definition is a little more helpful here. A trope, according to the Art Direction Handbook of Film, refers to a universally identified image imbued with several layers of contextual meaning, creating a new and visual metaphor. In other words, a trope is like a recurring kind of role or figure or idea. And I'll show an example in a second. And what I want to illustrate here is that bodies are often used to create and reproduce tropes. Think about like recurring images, recurring stereotypes, and archetypes in TV shows. And the important part here for us is that tropes are always racialized and always gendered. I have three examples of tropes here. I hope that we all have the references for them. Um, so the first one is Quinn Fabray from the TV show Glee. Here I want to mention like the trope that Quinn Fabray embodies is like the mean white girl cheerleader trope, who we've seen in all kinds of TV shows. The mean white girl. This is not the formal name of the trope, by the way, but the mean white girl trope is like the star student who is dating the jock, the captain of the football team, and is like mean to the nerds and the outcasts of high school. And I want to show that this is a trope because tropes are not just exclusive to people of color. White characters often are in tropes as well, but they're not, their whiteness is not always made critical, or their whiteness is not explicitly a part of their characterization. But white characters also get tropes as well and are oftentimes the main characters of their tropes, of the things they're in. Like something I was thinking about is like Marvel films, and thinking about how the majority of Marvel superheroes are white. Like thinking about Captain America, for example. So Quinn Fabray, think about like the mean cheerleader who's just like so pretty and gets whatever she wants. This is a trope that we've seen all the time in media. I want to bring up Pocahontas because indigenous people are also troped and represented in tropes in media. And so Pocahontas, it represents what scholars have called the Indian princess trope. And the Indian princess is characterized as docile, quiet, shy, and is usually oftentimes associated with like a white colonizing male partner who is their husband, who oftentimes is being sent off and sent away from her community in order to marry this person. And so Pocahontas represents um, Pocahontas is a trope, a problematic trope of how indigenous women are oftentimes just gendered as so like passive, and at the same time are always associated with white colonizing men as their partners. And so this is a trope that we've seen in other places as well, and Pocahontas is like one prevalent example of how indigenous women are misrepresented in the media. And next, I wanted to mention Mindy Kaling. She was on The Office, and then she had her own TV show after The Office called The Mindy Kaling Project. And one trope that I wanted to bring up with her is the model minority trope. The model minority trope refers to people who are Asian American and Pacific Islanders who represent financial and academic and professional success. And so Mindy Kaling is here performing as a doctor, but satirically as a doctor to represent how when we think about many Asian American people in media, we think about them as doctors who have who went to like the best schools, who are just so law-abiding professional citizens, who are just always super smart. And while one could argue that the model minority myth is not a bad thing, it is because it's assuming that all Asian American people are smart and that all Asian American people want to pursue certain fields in STEM. And it does not give any wiggle room for people who want to pursue other kinds of careers. And it also puts insurmountable amounts of pressure onto Asian American people in this way as well. And so this is another trope that is in the media. And so we see here how race and gender and also size, like we don't see any fat people in this scenario at all. We see how these are tropes and recurring kinds of stereotypes that we see in the media. And I think there are I think I would like you all to think about other examples as well of people who fit these roles, and also ask yourself how other kinds of white people, indigenous people, and Asian American people are represented in media. And next, I wanted to present one of the most important theories of representation, which was theorized by Patricia Hill Collins in her book Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment. So Patricia Hill Collins wrote a theory called the theory of controlling images. And the theory of controlling images argues that the simultaneous systems of oppression that Black women face are perpetuated by the misrepresentations of Black women in the media. So these misrepresentations of Black women are used to justify their oppression. And so in her chapter called Mammies, Matriarchs, and Other Controlling Images, Patricia Hill Collins offers some of the ways that Black women have been dominantly represented in the media, and how those misrepresentations affect them and sustain Black women's oppression. And so here are the theories that the images that she presents in her article. So the first one is the mammy trope, the mammy controlling image. The mammy is considered a fat, oftentimes dark-skinned Black woman who is considered motherly and asexual. Some of the characters I think about in my mind are the figure of Aunt Jemima, and Monique in the movie Precious, are figures that represent the mammy trope. Next is the matriarch, and the matriarch is characterized as bossy, single, angry, independent, and emasculating. So this kind of is similar to the angry Black woman trope that we see as well. So the matriarch is considered there. The next one that Patricia Hill Collins talks about is the welfare mother, also known as the welfare queen. And the welfare queen is seen as someone who is devious, a scammer, and lazy, and one who exploits government resources, and does not get quote unquote a real job. And then finally, Patricia Hill Collins notes that another trope around black women is the Jezebel slash video vixen, which is someone who is considered hypersexual, seductive, alluring, and tempting. And so, an example of this is what we might call like a video dancer or a video hoe. Oftentimes, like people often like look down upon black women who are in music videos and hip hop music videos because their role in the videos is to be nearly naked and like to be around the artist that's performing who's typically a black man. So these controlling images are, I think it's important with controlling images to understand that these are the tropes and ideologies that people created about black women. They were not self-created. They were imposed. And further, they're primarily stereotypes. When people see black women of certain sizes or certain characteristics, they are making deductions about who they are. So thinking about the mammy trope, for example, when if someone sees a fat black woman, they might assume that they are like friendly or motherly, and that's inherently problematic. To assume anything or to assume the personality of a black woman based on her body or based on her material circumstances is what controlling images is about. To impose and to assume and to create these kind of character types of people who are not even characters, people who are just living and working in their lives, is what is being talked about here in sustaining and perpetuating oppression towards black women. And controlling images again is like a really major theory in black feminist thought and black feminist theory. And many scholars have worked around this and built upon it. And it's been about 3 decades since the book came out, so a lot of scholarship has come afterwards. But this has been pretty foundational for thinking about how black women are represented in the media. And of course, we can see how these controlling images have been sustained and are continually prevalent in society, but we've also seen many people push back against them in tremendous ways as well. And so finally, I want us to think about one example of representation in the media. And for that, I want to look at the TV show Pose. So this is the intro sequence of the show. So Pose is a drama TV series that was around for 3 years. It just finished, I think it finished this spring. Season 3. It ran for 3 seasons and the final season was in the spring. And it focuses on the New York City ballroom scene from the 1980s and 1990s. So the ballroom scene refers to how Black and Latinx people, particularly like gay, cisgender men and transgender women, were competing in categories based on certain kinds of dressing, and that's where voguing comes from. So the ball scene is that competitive space where queer people of color and trans people of color would get together to compete and be in community with each other. And also this is where the notion of like a house comes from, a ballroom house. And so Pose is focusing on that because New York City was one of the most important places for ballroom culture in the 80s and 90s, and even today. So Pose grappled with a lot of huge topics that affected queer and trans communities in the 80s and 90s, which includes AIDS, transphobia, and the cultural appropriation of Vogue. Namely, like when Madonna made the song Vogue and took it inappropriately and appropriatively took it mainstream. And the cast is full of queer and trans people of color. I think that the majority of people, I think there's only like two white characters that have named roles, but the majority of the cast is queer and trans people of color. Janet Mock is an executive producer, and she is the first, I believe she's the first black trans woman to be an executive producer and director. And the two leads, who are the most notable leads on the show, are Andrea Rodriguez, who plays Blanca Evangelista, and Billy Porter, who's a Broadway star who played the character Pray Tell. And here's a photo of the gorgeous cast. From left to right, we have Haley Sahar, Angel Bismarck Curiel, India Moore, Delon Burnside, MJ Rodriguez, Angelica Ross, Dominique Jackson, Kamal Swain, and Billy Porter. Ryan Jamal Swain and Billy Porter. So this is the cast. Also, just note, if we're talking about desirability politics, these people are all what we would consider desirable. Do we see any people with visible disabilities here? Do we see anybody that is not? Do we see any fat people here at all? Do we see people that are dark skinned per se? I think the darkest people here would be Angelica Ross, Dominique Jackson, and Billy Porter. So these are things you want to still consider as you're thinking about this. And further, everybody here, I don't want to. Everybody here looks in some ways normatively of a certain gender. Like everybody here is presenting as not passable per se. Passable is not the term, but we don't see people that are presenting in ways that are deviating from gender norms as we see them. We might consider Swain's outfit to be non-normative, but Billy Porter wearing a dress. But everybody here is engaged in a binary representation of gender, and so that is what we might want to critique as well when we think about the desirability politics of the cast. But this is the cast, and so this is really major, and I'll get into how we can think about representation in a second. So, with the regards to diversity, Pose is groundbreaking. Pose literally centers a majority of LGBTQ black people. Again, Janet Mock is the first black trans woman to be an executive director and producer to the show. And the show is ethical because it had like notable queer and trans people be consultants for the show. So many people from the ballroom scene who have really legendary statuses consulted for the show. And so even in the production of the storylines and the productions of the scenes and performances, it was heavily the labor was heavily done by queer and trans people of color. So in terms of that, and also for a show to be on like a major network on FX and to have this kind of visibility is literally groundbreaking and does a lot of important work for diversity. And the show had some great storytelling as well. So at the third season, Billy Porter's character, Pray Tell, it's revealed that he has HIV, AIDS, and I think his HIV developed into AIDS, and he got into a relationship with Delon Burnside's character, and Billy Porter, I believe, is almost twice the age. Like the characters are, Billy Porter's character is twice the age of Delon Burnside's character, and they have a sex scene that I was gonna play it, but I'm not gonna play it. But the sex scene here is what one would consider softcore. It definitely shows some sexual acts in very non-revealing ways, but ways you can deduce. But it's very passionate. A lot of the scenes are full of embrace and full of kissing, and the scene was monumentous because Billy Porter openly talked about his own HIV status after this scene, and many people were in love with this scene because it shows that people were still having sex with HIV, and that HIV should not, it destigmatized HIV and AIDS, and which was important because HIV, AIDS, and people who are HIV positive face a lot of discrimination and stigma in dating and sex scenes because they're seen as not clean, or just seen as all kinds of negative things. And so it does that important work there. And what it also does, it also pushes back on ageism. To see Billy Porter engaged in sex in this way pushes back against ageism and how people might not think of older people in sexual ways as well. Billy Porter's not who would consider old per se, but seeing an older character having passionate sex like this, and very revealing sex is very important as well. And there are also many people who were in love with seeing two black gay cis men engaging in sex in this way, because it pushes back on like the hyper masculinization of black cis men, and the homophobia in that people do not want to see black gay cis men have sex. So this is one moment during Pose that people really were in love with because it really pushed back against so many things. Again, HIV stigma, ageism, and racism and homophobia. So that's just one example of some of the kinds of impactful storytelling that Pose did. But when we think about representation, I want us to think about not just like the content of the show, but also how do things get consumed? Thinking about culture institutions again. So Pose has an interesting history in its production and its award ceremonies. So during its 3-season run, Billy Porter was the only actor to receive Emmy nominations. Yes, he received the majority of the nominations for Emmys. And in 2019, he won the award for Outstanding Lead Actor for his character of Pray Tell. This was deeply controversial because out of all of the black trans women and black non-binary people on the show, Porter, a gay cis black man, received the majority of awards, nominations, and accolades for his role, and also some would argue that his role was like the second lead compared to MJ Rodriguez's role, who was the lead figure and who had the most camera time. However, MJ Rodriguez was finally nominated in 2021 at the 3rd season's run, but did not win the award and lost it to The Crown on Netflix. However, she became the first trans woman to ever be nominated for an Emmy. But it's still, like, it's really messed up that in this show where the majority of the cast is trans, MJ Rodriguez, who did most of the acting on the show, did not receive any accolades at all for her performance, but Billy Porter, who had significantly less camera time, received so much attention and so many accolades. Furthermore, the BET Awards did not invite any of the cast of the show in 2021. And so while we're seeing anti-blackness and transphobia in the Emmy Awards, we're also seeing queerphobia and transphobia by the BET Awards as well. What does it mean for an award show based on a network that centers black people to not include people of the cast who are queer and trans? It definitely shows that there's a lot of discrimination and animosity towards the show and its actors in different facets of award ceremonies. And so we should always think about how shows get received, and especially by institutions such as award granting institutions. And the problems do not stop there. So finally, there were a lot of inequalities at the writers' table that just came to light in the last few months. At the final season premiere, executive director Janet Mock exposes the production. Some argue that she was super drunk and then went off. Like everybody gave speeches at the premiere party, and Janet Mock completely went off. And said that she was only paid $40,000 per episode, while some of her white, gay, cisgender colleagues made much more than her. Mock further exposed the mistreatment of the trans actresses and actors who also got paid little for the major roles in the show. And they eventually spoke up publicly to thank Janet Mock for saying these things. And further, Mock added that for the final season, season 3, Mock only got to write and direct one episode in the entire season. Mock ends by saying, "Fuck Hollywood. Does this make you uncomfortable? It should. It should make you fucking shake in your motherfucking boots." So, first of all, it's important to note that while Janet Mock was the first black trans woman to be a director and writer for a TV show that is Pose, she was literally the only black trans woman on the entire writers panel, where everybody else was a white, gay, cis man. And so one could imagine the kinds of unsafety, animosity, and troubles that come with that. And furthermore, it shows that and like Pose has been revered as one of the most diverse TV shows to have existed thus far. And now we're seeing with the award ceremonies and with the politics at the writers' table that there are so many issues that still need to be fixed, even beyond the content of it as well. And so I think that for thinking about representation, I think Pose shows us how representation representation matters, but also representation, whether it matters or not, will always reveal how power operates. And so to conclude, representation is political. From the conception of an idea to how it gets written at the writer's table, and who gets to perform the roles and who gets honored and remembered for them. And so as we wrap up here, I want you to think about all the ways that we can engage with what we look at. When we look at a piece of media, ask yourself who directed it, who created it, who gets credited for it, and what does it make you feel? Representation is such an important way of engaging politics. And while it has its messiness, it also can help change our lives. It can empower us to go out there and be other forms of representatives for our communities, and it could also be counterproductive, and it could also just change our lives and our material circumstances forever. Although Pose did not have the most dynamic and successful run in TV, there are so many people out there who have felt seen or represented because of what they did on TV, and I think that counts for something. And so, again, I hope that this presentation has offered you some sorts of theories and skill sets to think about representation moving forward, and continue to think critically about what you consume. Thank you so much. Any feedback or questions or comments you have about this presentation will be greatly appreciated. Please enjoy that free write. And if you want to talk to me, my email is joebaez@gwu.edu. Thank you, and I wish you an awesome end to your semester.